7 o'clock in the morning, February 23, 1945. The sky above Los Baños, Laguna, Philippines. Lieutenant John Ringler stood in the open door of the lead C-47 transport aircraft, the wind tearing at his uniform at 500 feet. Below him, the drop zone was marked by white smoke rising from a Filipino guerrilla position. Behind him, 130 paratroopers from B Company, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, waited in 9 aircraft, packed shoulder to shoulder in their jump gear. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching day in the tropics. Ringler was 26 years old. He had trained for this moment his entire military career, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what came next. The mission briefing had been clear, almost impossibly clear. Drop precisely at 7 in the morning. Hit the camp within 15 minutes. Eliminate approximately 250 Japanese guards before they could execute 2147 starving prisoners. Extract all internees across 2 miles of enemy-held territory to waiting amphibious tractors. Do this 40 miles behind Japanese lines, with 8,000 to 10,000 enemy troops positioned just across the river, ready to counterattack. Complete the entire operation in 2 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. And if anything went wrong, if the timing slipped by even a few minutes, if the Japanese guards had time to react, if the 8,000 enemy soldiers realized what was happening, then 2147 men, women and children would die. The internees would be massacred. The rescue force would be destroyed. The mission would become one of the greatest disasters in American military history. Ringler checked his watch. 6:59. 30 seconds to jump time. The green light would flash in moments. Behind him, his troopers waited in silence, each man understanding that they were about to attempt something that military theorists would call impossible. A daytime paradrop at low altitude, deep behind enemy lines, to rescue starving civilians from a heavily guarded camp with no possibility of reinforcement and no hope of survival if the plan failed. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. 30 seconds. Ringler gripped the edge of the doorframe and looked down at the small field below, surrounded by jungle, bordered by power lines and railroad tracks. The drop zone was barely large enough for 9 aircraft to put 130 men on target. Miss the zone by 50 yards, and paratroopers would land in trees or on Japanese positions or in the camp itself, among the prisoners they were trying to save. The green light flashed. Ringler kicked out his equipment bundle and jumped into space. 130 paratroopers followed him into the sky over Los Baños, and in that moment, one of the most audacious rescue operations in military history began. But the story that brought Lieutenant Ringler to that aircraft door, that brought 2147 prisoners to the edge of death, that brought an entire airborne division into a race against time and against the cruelty of desperate men, that had begun 3 years earlier, when Japan conquered the Philippines and imprisoned thousands of civilians who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when the empire went to war. December 1941. The Japanese blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia was unprecedented in speed and violence. On December 7th, carrier-based aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. On December 8th, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines. Within hours, Japanese bombers destroyed the American Air Force on the ground. Within days, Japanese infantry began landing on Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, fought a delaying action. His forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. For 4 months, they held out against impossible odds. No reinforcements came, no supplies arrived. The Japanese noose tightened. On March 11th, 1942, MacArthur was ordered to evacuate to Australia. As he departed by PT boat, leaving his men behind to continue a fight they could not win, he made a promise that would define the remainder of his war. I shall return. By May 1942, Bataan had fallen. Corregidor surrendered. American and Filipino military forces became prisoners of war. The Bataan Death March killed thousands. But the Japanese did not only imprison soldiers. They imprisoned civilians, American businessmen, engineers, teachers, missionaries and their families, government workers, nurses. Anyone with Western citizenship or Allied connections was rounded up and placed in internment camps. At first, these civilians were held at Santo Tomas University in Manila, a Catholic institution converted into a prison holding over 4,000 people. The internees at Santo Tomas tried to maintain dignity and routine. They organized committees. They held classes for children. They celebrated holidays and birthdays. They prayed and sang and told themselves that liberation would come soon, that MacArthur would return, that this nightmare imprisonment would end. But as the months stretched into years, as 1942 became 1943, conditions deteriorated. Food rations decreased. Medical care became almost non-existent. The Japanese guards grew harsher, more brutal, more arbitrary in their punishments. In May 1943, the Japanese announced that some internees would be transferred to a new camp. The location was Los Baños, a town about 40 miles south of Manila, on the southern shore of Laguna Bay, the largest lake in the Philippines. The camp would be established on the grounds of the University of the Philippines College of Agriculture, a 60-acre campus wedged between the foothills of Mount Makiling and the lake. The first group of 800 men arrived in May 1943 to construct the camp. They built barracks from bamboo and thatch. They dug latrines. They cleared fields. The work was exhausting in the tropical heat, but at first, conditions seemed better than Santo Tomas. There was space to move. The countryside was beautiful. Filipino locals, sympathetic to the prisoners, sometimes left food near the camp perimeter. By early 1944, the camp population had grown to over 2,000. Among the internees were 12 United States Navy nurses who had been captured when the Philippines fell. There were missionaries from Protestant denominations and Catholic orders, including nuns and priests. There were engineers who had worked on infrastructure projects before the war. There were bankers and businessmen who had managed operations for American firms. There were teachers and government officials. And there were families, husbands and wives and children, some born in the camp, who had never known anything except imprisonment. The first commandant, Major Tanaka, was considered relatively fair. He allowed the internees some degree of self-government. Food rations were inadequate but sufficient to prevent mass starvation. Medical care was minimal but available. Life was hard but survivable. Then, in July 1944, everything changed. Major Tanaka was replaced by Major Iwanaka, and day-to-day operations were delegated to Warrant Officer Sadaki Konishi, the camp's second-in-command and supply officer. Konishi was a small man with an outsized cruelty. He told American interrogators after the war that he considered himself the strongest white race hater in the army. He told prisoners, "Before I'm done, you'll be eating dirt." Under Konishi's administration, Los Baños became a death camp. Food rations were systematically reduced. By January 1945, internees received less than 700 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic bodily functions. People began dying of starvation and diseases associated with malnutrition, beriberi, dysentery, edema. The death rate climbed to 2 per day. Konishi's cruelty was deliberate and sadistic. He withheld salt, knowing it would cause painful muscle cramps in malnourished bodies. When Filipino locals brought fruit to sell or give to the prisoners, Konishi ordered a truckload dumped on hot asphalt behind the camp in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The fruit rotted in hours. Prisoners who tried to salvage anything edible found only putrid waste. Margaret Whitaker, a teenage internee, kept a secret diary despite the ban on writing. Her entry from January 1945 read, "I weigh 83 pounds. Another man died this morning, 2 yesterday. The grave diggers are working overtime." Reverend William McCarthy, a Catholic priest imprisoned at Los Baños, later wrote about the final months. The struggle for survival forced us to eat weeds, flowers, vines, salamanders, the pulpy insides of banana trees, and juicy black bugs. Deaths mounted to 2 a day in January 1945. The internees understood with growing certainty that Konishi intended to kill them all, slowly, through starvation. The only question was whether liberation would arrive before everyone died, and then, in January 1945, hope arrived. American aircraft began flying overhead, heading to and from battles around Manila. The sound of distant artillery could be heard. The internees, who had a smuggled radio hidden in the camp, learned that American forces had landed on Luzon. MacArthur had returned. But liberation, the internees realized with growing dread, might come too late, or worse, it might trigger the very massacre they feared. By February 1945, the Japanese were losing the war for Luzon. American Sixth Army had landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th and was pushing south toward Manila. American Eighth Army, including the 11th Airborne Division, had landed at Nasugbu on January 31st and was driving north. Manila was being liberated in brutal street fighting. Santo Tomas had been freed on February 3rd. Bilibid Prison was liberated on February 4th. Cabanatuan Prison Camp had been raided by Rangers on January 30th, rescuing 522 prisoners of war. General MacArthur understood the urgency. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had issued a directive to execute all prisoners before they could be liberated. The Palawan massacre in December 1944, where 150 American prisoners of war had been herded into air raid shelters, doused with gasoline, and burned alive, proved that these were not idle threats. MacArthur wrote in his memoirs, "I hoped to proceed as rapidly as possible, especially as time was an element connected with the release of our prisoners. I knew that many of these half-starved and ill-treated people would die unless we rescued them promptly." On February 3, 1945, Major General Joseph May Swing, commanding the 11th Airborne Division, received orders to plan a rescue mission for Los Baños. The division was then heavily engaged in fighting south of Manila, battling for Nichols Field and Fort William McKinley against determined Japanese resistance. Swing requested permission to postpone the raid until his forces could be disengaged from combat. Permission was granted, but with the understanding that the mission should be executed at the earliest possible moment. General Swing was 50 years old, a graduate of West Point's class of 1915, the famous class the stars fell on that produced so many World War II generals. He was tall, white-haired, sharp-featured, with the bearing of a natural commander. Swing had been the artillery commander of the 82nd Infantry Division when it converted to airborne. He had advised Eisenhower on airborne operations in Sicily. He had formed the 11th Airborne Division at Camp McCall, North Carolina, in 1942 and had led it through combat in Leyte and now Luzon. His division's nickname was the Angels, and the internees at Los Baños, desperate for salvation, would soon understand why. Swing assigned the planning to his staff officers. Colonel Henry Muller, his G2 intelligence officer, began gathering information. Colonel Douglas Quant, the G3 operations officer, began developing the tactical plan. Major J. Vanderpool, commanding the General Guerrilla Command of Luzon, coordinated with Filipino partisans who had been watching Los Baños for weeks. The intelligence picture that emerged was both encouraging and terrifying. The camp held approximately 2,100 internees, most in desperate condition from malnutrition. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 250 men, but these were not frontline combat troops. Many were older soldiers, or those recovering from wounds or illness. Their discipline had grown lax. Most significantly, intelligence revealed that the guards performed morning calisthenics every day at 7 in the morning, leaving their weapons in the barracks, reducing the effective guard force to perhaps a dozen armed men during that 15-minute window. But across the San Juan River, just a few miles from Los Baños. 8,000 to 10,000 troops of the Japanese 8th Tiger Division were bivouacked. If these forces realized an American raid was in progress, they could counterattack within hours, trapping the rescue force and slaughtering everyone. The plan that emerged was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. It would require 4 separate task forces, perfect timing, absolute surprise, and flawless execution. Any failure at any point would doom the entire mission. Task Force 1 would be Company B of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant John Ringler. 130 paratroopers would jump at low altitude onto a small field west of the camp at exactly 7 in the morning, when the guards would be performing calisthenics. The paratroopers would assault the camp, eliminate the guards, and secure the internees. Task Force 2 would be the 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, minus Company B, under Major Henry Burgess. This force of about 300 men would board 54 amphibious tractors at 4 in the morning and cross Laguna Bay in darkness, landing 2 miles from the camp. They would march overland and arrive at Los Baños just as the paratroopers were securing the camp. The amphibious tractors would then transport all internees back across the lake. Task Force 3 would be the Division Reconnaissance Platoon under Lieutenant George Scow, together with about 75 Filipino guerrillas. These men would infiltrate into Los Baños the night before the raid, hide in positions around the camp, and attack at 7 in the morning from multiple directions to create confusion and prevent guards from organizing resistance. Task Force 4 would be the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Robert Soule. This force would move toward Los Baños from the north, blocking the highway and preventing the 8,000 Japanese troops across the river from reinforcing the camp. If the Japanese attacked in strength, Soule's regiment would have to hold long enough for the internees to be evacuated. Success required that all 4 task forces execute their missions simultaneously with split-second timing. If the paratroopers jumped too early, the guards would be armed and ready. Too late, and the amphibious force would arrive first, alerting the Japanese. If the reconnaissance platoon was discovered before the attack, the entire operation would collapse. If Soule's regiment failed to block the highway, thousands of Japanese soldiers would descend on Los Baños while the internees were being evacuated. Major Burgess, commanding the main airborne assault force, understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. He later wrote, "How could my force of 412 paratroopers slip undetected deep into Japanese-controlled territory, wipe out a large number of enemy guards at the camp before they could kill the inmates, and bring back to safety 2,200 weak men, women, and children, many of whom were unable to walk?" The answer, General Swing decided, was that they would not try to slip in undetected. They would strike with overwhelming violence and speed. They would rely on surprise, perfect timing, and the audacity of the plan itself to achieve success before the Japanese could react. On February 12th, a 19-year-old Greek Filipino named Freddy Zevolakos escaped from Los Baños and made contact with Filipino guerrillas. He carried a message to American forces about conditions in the camp and was sent back with the promise that rescue was coming. The internee committee, fearing Japanese reprisal if anything went wrong, decided that prisoners should do nothing to help the raid, should simply wait for liberation to arrive. On February 18th, the 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry, was pulled out of combat on the Genko line and moved to Parañaque to rest and prepare for the mission. The men were told nothing at first, only that they would be conducting a special operation requiring rehearsal and preparation. On the night of February 21st, Lieutenant Scow and his 31-man reconnaissance platoon departed for Los Baños in Filipino fishing boats called bancas. They crossed Laguna Bay in darkness, landed near the village of Nanhaya, and met with guerrillas and camp escapees. They split into teams and infiltrated positions around the camp perimeter, hiding in the jungle, waiting for the assault to begin. On February 22nd, the paratroopers received their final briefing. They learned for the first time what they would be doing. The reaction was a mixture of excitement, disbelief, and grim determination. One paratrooper later recalled, "We thought it was suicide." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Jump at low altitude in daylight, hit a prison camp 40 miles behind enemy lines, extract over 2,000 people with the Japanese army just across the river. But nobody refused. These were civilians, women and children, Americans. We were going. That night, the men of the 1st Battalion boarded their amphibious tractors at 4 in the morning on February 23rd. 54 LVT-4 Amtraks, each capable of carrying about 25 troops or internees, slipped into the dark waters of Laguna de Bay and began the crossing. The lake was 8 miles wide at the crossing point. The journey would take nearly 3 hours. In the darkness, the sound of diesel engines echoed across the water. Any Japanese patrol craft on the lake could destroy the entire force. At 5:30 in the morning, Company B paratroopers arrived at Nichols Field and began rigging their equipment. They put on parachutes, checked their weapons, loaded extra ammunition. Lieutenant Ringler gathered his men for a final word. "We're jumping at 500 feet. There's no reserve. If your main chute doesn't open, you're dead. We're jumping over a small field with power lines and trees. If you miss the drop zone, you're on your own. We hit the camp fast and hard. Kill every guard you see. Protect the prisoners. Get them to the Amtraks. Any questions?" There were none. These were professional soldiers, men who had trained for years for exactly this kind of operation. They boarded 9 C-47 transport aircraft at 6:40 in the morning. At 6:55, the aircraft took off for the 15-minute flight to Los Baños. Inside the camp, the internees were going through their morning routine, unaware that salvation was minutes away. Navy nurse Dorothy Still wrapped a blanket around her skeletal legs, trying to ward off the morning chill. She had been on overnight duty in the camp hospital, caring for patients dying of starvation and disease. Another night, another patient lost. How many more could they endure? At exactly 7 in the morning, as they did every morning, the Japanese guards assembled for calisthenics on the parade ground. They stacked their rifles and began their exercises. Warrant Officer Konishi was not present. He rarely participated in morning drill. At 7 in the morning, Lieutenant George Scow's reconnaissance platoon, hidden in the jungle surrounding the camp, heard the drone of approaching aircraft. 9 C-47 seconds, flying low and fast from the north. Scow threw a white smoke grenade onto the drop zone to mark it for the pilots. At 7 in the morning, Lieutenant John Ringler stood in the open door of the lead C-47 and saw white smoke rising from the small field below. The pilot banked slightly to line up on the drop zone. Ringler turned to his stick of paratroopers and shouted over the engine noise, "Close in the door!" The green light flashed. Ringler jumped. In 3 seconds, he was on the ground, landing in soft earth near the edge of the drop zone. He gathered his weapon and looked up to see parachutes filling the sky, 130 men descending into Los Baños. The jump was perfect. Every man landed on or near the drop zone. No casualties from the jump itself. Ringler later recalled, "I was jump master of the lead aircraft, and at dawn, 700 hours, we jumped and all landed on the drop zone without casualties." At the same moment, Ringler's boots hit the ground. Scow's reconnaissance platoon opened fire on Japanese guard posts. Filipino guerrillas attacked from 3 directions. The carefully planned simultaneous assault became reality. The Japanese guards, caught in the middle of calisthenics, unarmed, scattered in confusion. Some ran for their weapons in the barracks. Some fled toward the hills. Some stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. American machine guns cut them down without mercy. The reconnaissance platoon stormed guard towers and pillboxes. Private First Class Robert Santos and his squad charged a fortified position. 2 of his men were wounded. 1 Filipino guerrilla was hit, but they silenced the position. Santos later remembered. Then suddenly a third, unreported machine gun opened fire on us. We spotted this machine gun on a knoll near a large tree overlooking our exposed position. We kept it under fire until B Company troopers reinforced us. Ringler organized his paratroopers and led them toward the camp. They covered the few hundred yards at a run, firing at any Japanese soldier who appeared. By 7:15, 15 minutes after the jump, American paratroopers had breached the camp perimeter and were inside Los Baños, clearing barracks, eliminating guards, shouting to the terrified internees that they were Americans, that rescue had arrived, that everyone needed to move to the assembly point immediately. The internees reacted with shock and disbelief. For 3 years they had dreamed of this moment. For months they had prayed for it. And now, impossibly, American paratroopers were running through the camp, killing Japanese guards, telling them to gather their belongings and move quickly to the beach. Some internees cried. Some laughed hysterically. Some stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Navy nurse Dorothy Still later described the moment. We heard gunfire and explosions. We thought the Japanese were executing prisoners. Then an American soldier burst into the hospital and shouted, "We're Americans! We're here to get you out! Move to the assembly point now!" I thought I was hallucinating from malnutrition. The paratroopers moved through the camp with brutal efficiency. Japanese guards who resisted were shot without hesitation. Those who surrendered were secured. Those who fled were hunted down. By 7:30, 30 minutes after the initial jump, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. The camp was secure. But the mission was far from complete. 2147 internees, most of them barely able to walk from malnutrition, needed to be moved 2 miles through enemy territory to the lakeshore, loaded onto amphibious tractors, and evacuated across 8 miles of open water, all while 8,000 Japanese troops were positioned just a few miles away, capable of counterattacking at any moment. Major Burgess's amphibious force arrived at Los Baños at 7:35. The 54 Amtraks roared up from the beach, their tracks churning through soft earth, their diesel engines screaming. Burgess later described the scene. The camp was burning in places from the firefight. Dead Japanese guards were scattered around the perimeter, and there were the internees, thousands of them, skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand, but moving toward the Amtraks with whatever strength they had left. The evacuation began immediately. American paratroopers and Filipino guerrillas helped internees board the Amtraks. The most severely ill and injured were loaded first. Mothers with infants, children, the elderly, those who could walk helped those who could not. One internee later recalled, "I weighed 98 pounds. I had been 170 before imprisonment. I could barely lift my feet. An American soldier, this young paratrooper, who couldn't have been 20 years old, picked me up like I weighed nothing and put me on the Amtrak. He said, 'You're going home, sir.' The loading took 90 minutes. 90 minutes during which the entire rescue force was exposed and vulnerable. If the Japanese across the river realized what was happening, if they mounted a counterattack, the Amtraks would be trapped on the beach. The internees would be caught in the open, and massacre would follow. Colonel Sewell's Glider Infantry Regiment held the highway north of Los Baños, blocking the road from the San Juan River. They dug in and waited. Japanese patrols probed their positions but did not attack in force. The Japanese, confused by the speed and violence of the American assault, hesitated. That hesitation saved thousands of lives. By 9 in the morning, 2 hours after the parachute assault began, all 2147 internees were loaded on the Amtraks. The last American soldiers boarded. The Amtraks pulled away from the beach and headed across Laguna Bay toward American lines. The evacuation convoy stretched across miles of open water. 54 Amtraks, carrying over 2,000 internees and 400 paratroopers. They were completely exposed. A single Japanese aircraft could have strafed them. Artillery from shore positions could have destroyed them. But no attack came. The Japanese were still trying to understand what had happened, still attempting to organize a response. During the crossing, one Amtrak came under machine gun fire from the shore. Sergeant Harold Mason, operating a 75mm pack howitzer mounted on baggage piled in an Amtrak, recalled, "The howitzer was high enough on the pile of baggage for us to contemplate firing around back at the hill, which was the only place we thought the firing might be coming from. So we loaded and fired at the hill with a charge one. The machine gun stopped firing, but the Amtrak was dipping from side to side and taking on water with each dip. The Amtrak driver pointed a .45 pistol back at us and said, 'Anyone loading that thing again gets a bullet in the head.' By 11:30 in the morning, the first Amtraks reached the western shore of Laguna de Bay at Mamatid. The internees were helped off and loaded onto trucks for transport to New Bilibid prison in Muntinlupa, which had been converted into a liberation center for freed prisoners. Medical personnel were waiting. Food, water, and medical care were provided immediately. By noon, all 2147 internees had been evacuated. All were alive. Not a single prisoner had been killed during the rescue. American casualties were astonishingly light. 2 paratroopers killed, 2 wounded. 1 reconnaissance platoon member wounded. 2 Filipino guerrillas killed. Japanese casualties were estimated at between 70 and 90 killed. The rest of the garrison had fled or been captured. General MacArthur issued a statement the next day. "Nothing could be more satisfying to a soldier's heart than this rescue. I am deeply grateful. God was certainly with us today." But the story did not end with the successful rescue. It ended with an atrocity that revealed the depths of Japanese desperation and hatred. A few days after the raid, Warrant Officer Sadaaki Konishi, who had escaped during the assault, returned to Los Baños with a force of Japanese soldiers and pro-Japanese Makapili militia. They found the camp empty. The prisoners were gone. In rage and frustration, Konishi and his men turned their fury on the civilian population of Los Baños and surrounding villages. Over the next several days, Japanese forces massacred approximately 1,500 Filipino men, women, and children, killing anyone suspected of collaborating with the liberators or aiding the guerrillas. Entire villages were burned. Families were slaughtered. The brutality was systematic and deliberate. Konishi was later captured in Manila in July 1945. He was recognized by a Los Baños internee, while Konishi was assigned to a prisoner of war work detail cleaning rubble near Wak Wak Golf Club. He was arrested, tried as a Class C war criminal for violations of the laws of war, and convicted of multiple charges, including the starvation deaths of over 300 prisoners and the massacre of civilians. During his trial, Konishi admitted his role in the massacres, stating that he had been conducting a war and left such mere details to his staff. He showed no remorse. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo on April 30th, 1949. A Merinol nun later reported that Konishi converted to Christianity shortly before his execution. The Los Baños raid became a textbook example of successful special operations. Decades later, General Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wrote to the 11th Airborne Division Association, "I doubt that any airborne unit in the world will ever be able to rival the Los Baños prison raid. It is the textbook airborne operation for all ages and all armies." Military historians have analyzed the raid extensively, identifying the factors that contributed to its success. Perfect intelligence provided by Filipino guerrillas and camp escapees, meticulous planning that accounted for every detail of timing and coordination. The element of surprise, achieved by striking during morning calisthenics when guards were unarmed. The audacity of a daylight parachute assault that the Japanese never anticipated. The speed of execution that prevented enemy counterattack. The courage of paratroopers, guerrillas, and pilots who risked their lives for people they had never met. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the raid was what it revealed about the value that American military leadership placed on civilian lives. General Swing committed a significant portion of his division to the operation, pulling units out of combat during a critical phase of the Manila campaign. He risked hundreds of soldiers' lives to save people who were not combatants, who contributed nothing to the military effort, who were simply civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. That decision reflected something fundamental about American values and military culture. The belief that American citizens, whether soldiers or civilians, whether useful to the war effort or not, deserved rescue if rescue was possible. The understanding that leaving people to die when you had the power to save them was unacceptable, even if the rescue was dangerous and militarily illogical. The internees who survived Los Baños carried the memory of February 23, 1945, for the rest of their lives. They remembered the sound of aircraft engines in the morning sky. They remembered white parachutes filling the air like angels descending. They remembered young American soldiers running through the camp, killing the guards who had tormented them for years. They remembered being lifted onto amphibious tractors by men who treated them with gentleness and respect despite their skeletal condition and filthy clothing. Many internees wrote letters to Major Burgess, General Swing, and General MacArthur, expressing gratitude that words could barely capture. One committee of internees wrote, "We were dying by inches, watching our friends and family members perish from starvation and disease, knowing that liberation was close but might come too late." Then, on February 23rd, salvation arrived with violence and glory. American paratroopers appeared as if from nowhere, fought with fury to protect us, and carried us to safety. We owe them our lives. We can never repay that debt. Among those rescued at Los Baños was Frank Buckles, who would later become known as the last surviving American veteran of World War I. He had been captured when the Philippines fell and had survived 3 years of imprisonment. After Los Baños, he lived until 2011, dying at age 110, one of the last living connections to both world wars. The 12 Navy nurses rescued from Los Baños all survived and returned home. They had endured imprisonment, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of execution. They had cared for fellow prisoners with no medical supplies, no equipment, nothing but their training and compassion. After liberation, they received numerous decorations and were honored for their courage and dedication. The men of the 11th Airborne Division continued fighting for another 5 months after Los Baños. They participated in the liberation of southern Luzon. They fought in brutal mountain campaigns against Japanese holdouts. When the war ended in August 1945, the 11th Airborne was the first American division to land in Japan. They formed General MacArthur's honor guard during the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Joseph Swing continued to lead the division in the occupation of Japan until 1948. He was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism during fighting on Mount McCollard in April 1945, where he personally led tank destroyers forward through intense fire. He retired from the Army as a lieutenant general and died in 1984 at age 90. Lieutenant John Ringler, who led the parachute assault on Los Baños, survived the war and returned home. His jump at 7 in the morning on February 23, 1945, became one of the most famous moments in airborne history, studied by every generation of paratroopers since. Major Henry Burgess, who commanded the overall ground operation, continued his military career and retired as a colonel. He attended multiple reunions of Los Baños survivors over the years, always humble about his role, always insisting that the real heroes were the Filipino guerrillas who provided intelligence and the paratroopers who executed the assault. The Filipino guerrillas who made the raid possible were never fully recognized for their contributions. They provided the intelligence that made planning possible. They infiltrated the camp area days before the assault and held positions waiting for the attack. They fought alongside American paratroopers during the assault. 2 gave their lives in the operation. After the war, many returned to civilian life with little recognition, their role in one of history's greatest rescue operations largely forgotten. On February 23, 2016, the 71st anniversary of the raid, the University of the Philippines Los Baños held a commemoration ceremony at Baker Hall, one of the few original buildings still standing. Survivors, now in their 80s and 90s, attended. Children and grandchildren of both internees and rescuers came to honor the memory. Filipino citizens who had been children during the war remembered the massacre that followed the raid and spoke of the terrible price their grandparents' generation paid for supporting the Americans. The raid has become part of Philippine national memory as well as American military history. The Filipinos who aided the internees, who risked their lives to pass information to guerrillas, who suffered brutal reprisals after the rescue, are honored as heroes. The massacre of 1,500 civilians is remembered as a war crime and a reminder of the brutality of occupation. The story of Los Baños reveals something profound about the nature of courage, about the decisions that define character, about the willingness of some people to risk everything for strangers. General Swing could have declined the mission as too dangerous. He could have argued that his division was needed in combat operations around Manila. He could have said that rescuing 2,100 civilians was not worth risking 400 paratroopers. But he did not say that. He accepted the mission, planned it meticulously, committed his best troops to its execution, and succeeded in saving every single internee without losing more than a handful of soldiers. Lieutenant Ringler could have refused to lead the parachute assault. A daylight jump at 500 feet into a small drop zone surrounded by power lines and enemy positions was almost suicidal. But he did not refuse. He jumped first, as a commander should, and his men followed him into hell because they trusted him. The reconnaissance platoon could have withdrawn when they realized how close they were to Japanese positions, how exposed they would be during the hours of waiting before the assault. But they did not withdraw. They held their positions in the jungle, hiding in silence, waiting for the moment when they would spring the ambush that would save thousands of lives. The internees themselves showed remarkable courage and discipline. Despite 3 years of imprisonment, despite starvation and disease, despite watching friends and family members die around them, they maintained hope. When rescue came, they followed orders, moved quickly despite their weakness, helped those who could not help themselves, and endured the terrifying evacuation across open water without panic or chaos. In the final analysis, the Los Baños raid succeeded because everyone involved understood what was at stake and accepted the risks necessary to save innocent lives. It succeeded because Filipino guerrillas gathered intelligence at risk of execution, because American planners developed a complex operation and rehearsed it until every man knew his role, because pilots flew their aircraft at dangerously low altitude to drop paratroopers on target, because paratroopers jumped into enemy fire without hesitation, because Amtrak drivers crossed 8 miles of open water under threat of enemy fire, because every person involved, from General MacArthur in Manila to the youngest private on the ground at Los Baños, believed that American civilians trapped behind enemy lines deserved rescue even at great risk and cost. That belief, that commitment, that willingness to risk everything for people who could offer nothing in return, represents something exceptional about American military culture at its best. It is not always lived up to. Wars are full of failures, mistakes, and crimes. But, in the early morning hours of February 23, 1945, that ideal became reality. 130 paratroopers jumped from aircraft at 500 feet, landed in enemy territory 40 miles behind Japanese lines, assaulted a fortified prison camp, eliminated a Japanese garrison, evacuated 2,147 starving prisoners, and brought every single one of them home alive. They did this in 2 hours. They did this with minimal casualties. They did this so flawlessly that military historians still study the operation as the perfect example of a rescue mission. And they did this for people who were not soldiers, who had no military value, who were simply American citizens who needed help. That is what made Los Baños special. Not the tactical brilliance, though that was remarkable. Not the courage of the soldiers, though that was exceptional. But the fundamental belief that drove the entire operation from conception to execution. The belief that American lives matter, that civilians trapped by war deserve rescue if rescue is possible, that no risk is too great and no effort too extreme when innocent people are dying. Lieutenant John Ringler stood in the door of a C-47 transport aircraft on the morning of February 23, 1945, looked down at a prison camp where 2,100 people were dying of starvation, and jumped. That jump changed history. It saved lives. It vindicated the belief that courage and careful planning and absolute commitment can achieve what seems impossible. Behind him, 129 paratroopers followed. They fell through 500 feet of tropical air and landed in the midst of their enemies. They fought with fury and precision. They won a battle that should have been unwinnable. They rescued people who should have died, and in doing so, they created a legacy that endures 80 years later. A legacy of selfless service, a legacy of tactical excellence, a legacy of the belief that some things are worth any risk, any cost, any sacrifice. The Los Baños raid was not just a successful military operation, it was a statement of values. It was a demonstration that in the midst of total war, in the final brutal months of fighting in the Pacific, American forces would still commit substantial resources to saving civilian lives, even when those civilians contributed nothing to victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.